Good day. My name is Chris Hintz. I'm from Savannah State University, and I'm here to share some recent work that my SSU colleagues, Sean Rosenquist, who is also a principal at Cuttybum Hydrology, and our graduate student, Summer Wright, are conducting as part of research funded by the 2020-2022 Georgia Sea Grant. Fundamentally, the Sea Grant research is to expand development of a few techniques that Sean and I initially worked on as part of some rapid funding Georgia Sea Grant made available after Hurricane Irma impacted the Georgia coastline in 2017. We developed a series of complementary methodologies for identifying head of tide in upland rivers using Fourier and wavelength analyses. In so doing, we confirmed anecdotal and historic reporting of the head of tide location in the Savannah River. The specific goals of our current research, short term, are to determine the current head of tide in all 5 Georgia upland rivers: Savannah, Ogeechee, Altamaha, Satilla, and St. Mary's. By doing so, though, we hope to identify areas critical to emergency management and preparedness, regions of protected habitat, improve our baseline data set for monitoring sea level rise from climate change or coastal development, for example, the recent Savannah Harbor expansion project. Lastly, based on our head of tide observations in the Savannah River influenced by upland flooding, our current research is diving deep into these impacts so that we can better understand the hydrological interactions of upland flooding and coastal estuarine tidal flow. This all leads to the long-term goal of improving coastal resiliency by understanding the impacts of stochastic events like river flooding or storm surge, acting on top of the normal effects like our downstream river flow that interacts with our strong semi-diurnal tides here in coastal Georgia. Head of tide is defined in order to delineate private versus state lands and drives a substantial portion of delineation of our aquatic systems. The Protection of Tidewaters Act specifies that the state has ownership of water that are, quote, affected by the tide where the tide rises and falls, end quote. This was defined to be tidal range greater than 0.2 feet, but we all must realize that the head of tide influences other state and local management, including predictive flood mapping and emergency management, land use development, and environmental protection, and serves as one gauge for the future impacts of climate change. With the emergency funding secured after Hurricane Irma hit the Georgia coastline, Sean Rosenquist and I installed hobo pressure sensors along the Savannah River from approximately River Mile 30 to River Mile 55. The Savannah River, with its long history of commercial shipping, is highly controlled principally by Thurman Dam, built in the 1940s. The river is also well instrumented, most notably by the NOAA tide gauge at Fort Pulaski, near the mouth of the river, dating back to 1935. However, in the regions above and below the head of tide, USGS river gauges have recorded water level for approximately 20 years, and all the data in the region is easily accessible for the past 12 years. Added to these long-term data sets, SSU has installed 6 temporary tide gauges above Abercorn Creek at River Mile 29 to about 10 miles below Clio, Georgia, located at River Mile 65. These sensors cover over 20 miles of the river. These 6 temporary sensors established our head of tide determination that corroborated Army Corps of Engineers reports in the 1960s and 1990s that the head of tide was near Ebenezer Landing at River Mile 45. However, this effort, although relatively inexpensive in sampling equipment costing only $350 per station, is rather costly in human capital to get into the field, install the temporary gauges, and return regularly to collect the data from the instruments about every 4 to 6 months. This effort does yield rather fine spatial scale determination of the head of tide, in addition to fine measurements of head of tide migration from stochastic events such as upland flooding. The 2 types of analysis we do are Fourier and wavelength. The figure on the left shows the raw data collected from just over 2-month deployment on the Savannah River at River Mile 45 in 2018. During this time, there's generally a period of normal flow down the river with some elevated stages after passing rain showers. Fourier analysis takes these complex river stage waveforms, the blue in the video, and separates them into a series of sine waves with different frequency and amplitude, the green waveforms in the video. The sum of these component sine waves developed by Fourier yields the original waveform, but looking at each individual component wave that makes up the total river stage waveform helps identify the individual factors that drive the river stage. More than a single period, though, the total of the Fourier determined periods provide a fingerprint of the semi-diurnal tide closely related to the sidereal day. Although there are diurnal and semi-diurnal components in this data set, fewer related to the solar day at 12.0 hours. with the majority related to the Earth-Moon or Earth-Sun-Moon orbital mechanics. This provides high confidence that indeed our regular variation in water depth is driven by the tide and not another environmental effect. The second method used in this study translates a set of potential waveform matches of various amplitudes and frequencies through a time series, measuring goodness of fit at each location in the time series for each potential match. Wavelength analysis looks at all parts of the wave but focuses down to small localized areas analyzed sequentially along the time series. In the demonstration video, you will see a small wave peak subsets in each of the raw data. These are blue. They are compared to the ideal period and amplitude for a single peak, which is green. And if the match is close enough, it is cataloged into a two-dimensional histogram of period and amplitude representing all the waves that make up the complex river stage data. We developed these two-dimensional histograms that link the period in hours with the wave height. And remember that wavelength looks at half wave amplitude, which is doubled to develop wave height. Evidence of tidal influence are a large number of occurrences at 0.1 feet or higher during the approximately 12-hour period. More than 90% of the wavelet matches meet this criteria at this site, provide strong evidence that the head of tide is upstream from this location. Yet this method is not truly definitive and only provides additional evidence to the tide impacts in this region. One of the rivers we instrumented in summer of 2020, the Altamaha, is less instrumented than the Savannah. However, we are fortunate that two river gauges, one at Everett City near River Mile 30 and the second at Doctortown, Georgia, approximately 30 miles upstream, are located overlapping the transition of head of tide. SSU added 6 temporary gauges around the Everett City gauge from River Mile 24 to River Mile 40. Further, there are 2 more sensors downstream maintained by the Georgia Coastal Ecosystem Long-Term Ecological Research Station on Sapple Island that both include depth measurements. The top graph is the upstream non-tidal data set on the Altamaha at Doctortown, Georgia at River Mile 65. The Altamaha's flood stages, action, minor, moderate, are defined by Doctortown gauge, help inform how to investigate the data downstream at the tidal Everett City River gauge. Accounting for an approximate 48-hour lag in floodwaters moving between Doctortown and Everett City, the lower graph of Everett City River gauge is highlighted based on the Doctortown flood stage that flowed downriver. Here is a representative analysis for the Everett City River gauge on the Altamaha. Fourier analysis of all data on the Altamaha River gives strong indication that there is a regular tide here by identifying several semi-diurnal and diurnal tidal harmonics at the Everett City River gauge. This clearly establishes normal head of tide upstream from this river gauge at River Mile 30. However, if you analyze downstream river gauge data when the upstream Doctortown River gauge is in action stage or higher, the Fourier tidal signals are suppressed. Now this is a bit deceptive in that we see focusing on in a very short periods of river gauge data, particularly during receding floods, the tidal signal rebounds, but these data do not occur often enough to identify the tidal influence with Fourier analysis. Lastly, wavelength analysis can estimate the amplitude and wavelength of each individual stage altering event in the river and then enumerate them to describe behavior of stage at that location. This gives insight in the frequency and the amplitude of the complex river gauge data. The 12-hour portion of this data is matched and plotted against upstream river stage to illustrate the sensitivity of local tide range to upstream river stage, something that we've not done with other methods yet. This information allows us to make inferences about the interaction of upstream stage with tide and potentially provides more information regarding the head of tide migration in the vicinity of the downstream river gauge. Further, the slope of this interaction, how much tidal range is reduced at elevated upstream stage, yields insight in the upstream system and the hydrological interactions between opposing river flows. So broadening our analyses across the first 3 upland river systems we've studied so far in Georgia, we will start with the Savannah River that was previously identified the normal head of tide up near Ebenezer Landing at River Mile 45, but also noted that the head of tide migrated downstream below River Mile 39 with upland flooding. From our analysis of the long-term USGS gauge data, it is clear that the head of tide migration moves quickly from River Mile 45 down below River Mile 39 nearly as soon as the river floods. Both analyses come to the same conclusion, giving a lot of confidence in this finding. Further, these analyses indicate that head of tide does not move much farther downstream, and certainly not below Port Wentworth at the I-95 bridge during flooding events. Our current deployment of temporary tide gauge sensors should capture this head of tide migration during the flooding events that occurred during February of 2021. Turning to the Altamaha, while this river is less instrumented than the Savannah, we've illustrated to you that the USGS gauge at Everett City already experiences the transition of head of tide during flood events, and all analyses indicate that the normal head of tide is above the site but quickly migrates below river mile 30 during upstream flooding events. Interestingly, though, the wavelength analysis gives indication that the head of tide will not move far below Everett City during flooding, but we need additional information to elucidate this observation. We have instrumented the region, and again, the flooding events during the winter of 2021 look to capture the head of tide migration well through the river system, so we can test this hypothesis later this year. The two upper USGS stations on the Ogeechee do not give strong evidence of head of tide migrating across their locations. Neither Eden nor Ellabelle indicate a regular tidal influence. However, the Richmond Hill River gauge is tidal at most flow conditions. The current winter 2021 flooding on the Ogeechee is higher than any modern day analyzed and has not been observed since the late 1990s. It is clear that the region we instrumented below Ellabelle at river mile 54 and above Richmond Hill at river mile 37 is where the head of tide is located in this river. So we are poised to evaluate the 20 to 50 year flood event that with our temporary sensor network that should yield improved information about the flood response in this region. So in conclusion, the methods we employ provide good agreement on where and when the head of tide migrates through the different river basins, but we have to use these approaches in concert as they have unique strengths and weaknesses. The much larger problem continues to be the legal definition of head of tide. For example, how often must it occur and how is tidal height officially measured? We employ multiple methods of identifying head of tide that are related to this formal definition. However, there are nuances to each technique we use. Particularly, we currently agree head of tide present when we identify the tide greater than 50% of the time, or that we use a statistical test to identify the tidal harmonic in Fourier analysis. Anecdotally, we have heard field personnel use other indicators. All of these move away from the legal definition and into different levels of ambiguity and are subject to interpretation. But the recent research has provided us a better understanding of the current river gauge resources and how to best use them when our Sea Grant funding ends, when we can no longer support temporary tide gauges. Further, the analyses will provide insight in understanding the critical components driving head of tide migration during stochastic events. We may be able to develop new ways of employing the long-term assets in the region in conjunction with our short-term deployments to produce critical knowledge that is valuable in modeling river response during future events. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to hearing from you during the live Q&A in a few weeks.